Hello, I'm Steve Satterfield. Welcome to my proposal defense presentation, Phase 1. The project is entitled Reducing Cognitive Load in the Course Selection Process to Facilitate Lifelong Learning. Now let's take a look at lifelong learning. What does the term even mean? Well, informal lifelong learning is nothing new. Children have always learned games from each other outside of any formal instruction and primarily without any adult involvement. And they learn to ride bicycles. Adults learn to cook new dishes, even to re-examine and modify old belief systems in light of new evidence. Lifelong learning has been a much used phrase over the past few decades, so where did the current usage originate? Probably the two events that were most responsible for solidifying the current popular use of the phrase were the publication of the Fourier Report in 1972 and the Delors Report in 1996. Now, these two reports were the result of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO commissions that were brought together to study education. Both reports recommended that education should be lifelong, but the Delors report took the idea a step further and recommended that education should be not only lifelong, but that there were 4 pillars of learning. And those are learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. And that at every phase of life, one should learn something from each of the 4 pillars. The lifelong learning envisioned by the UNESCO commissions encompasses both formal and informal learning. Universities and community colleges should have strong continuing education programs and leisure learning programs for older adults. The Delors recommendation that each of the 4 pillars is important at every phase of life suggests that some of the types of content now found primarily in leisure learning programs should be worked into programs that target other age groups as well. The primary aim of the UNESCO commissions was to enable a worldwide democratic society by promoting educational opportunities for all, and thereby to reduce the chances of international conflict. After these reports were published and the concept of lifelong learning entered popular culture, some more utilitarian justifications emerged. And these have to do with the rapid expansion of human knowledge, or the shrinking half-life of knowledge as it becomes obsolete more quickly as new knowledge emerges, the shrinking pool of younger adults to support the growing population of senior citizens. This is called the potential support ratio, and the increasing speed of major societal change. Growth of knowledge. The literature is rife with variations on Buckminster Fuller's well-known doubling time of knowledge curve from his work entitled Critical Path in 1982, and with post-1982 trends and predictions added, but without the supporting data. I chose to illustrate the increasing growth of knowledge with my own research. Now, I chose, in this instance, the growth of medical knowledge. The dissertation paper contains an assertion attributed to Denson in a 2011 paper that medical knowledge doubled at the rate of every 50 years in 1950. And that by this year, 2020, it should be doubling at the rate of every 73 hours. The growth of specialization by physicians may be seen as a corollary to the growth of specialized knowledge in medicine. And so here is a timeline starting in 1900 showing the emergence and growth of medical specialization in the United States. It shows that in 1900 there were virtually no medical specialists in the U.S., but that by 2015, 88% of U.S. physicians were specialists. Another corollary to the growth of knowledge is the growth of knowledge workers. These are people who get paid to think for a living. I compiled this curve from multiple decades of publications of the U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The curve shows that in 1900, only about 5% of the workforce in the U.S. had professional jobs that today would be categorized as knowledge work. Most others were employed in farm or industrial labor or domestic work. Then through the 20th century, we see the percentage of what we now call knowledge workers rising steadily and then beginning to climb dramatically after World War II, throughout the Cold War and the space race. We see a spike around 1970 and then a much steeper climb in the 21st century. The accelerating rate of societal change. Here we see a graph showing the length of time it took for two major societal changes to occur in the United States between 1787 and 2015. They're similar in that they both relate to marriage, but one of them took 180 years to become accepted, and the other, more recent change, took about 8 years. And these are interracial marriage and same-sex marriage. It took nearly 200 years for the majority of the United States to make interracial marriage legal. But it only took about 8 years for same-sex marriage. Now, these two factors alone, the rapid speed at which knowledge becomes obsolete and the rapid changes in what is and is not accepted in society, make it imperative that people, older people especially, continue to learn and to understand the changes going on around us. Otherwise, we run the risk of perceiving ourselves to be cut off from present-day society, as it might be seen as something very foreign to us. The paper cites research indicating that social isolation is correlated with physical and psychological problems, and that the perception of social isolation is an even stronger predictor of health and cognitive issues than the actual number of social connections. So, in other words, even though an individual may still have the same number of social connections as before, if one begins to perceive himself as being socially isolated, then that is a strong predictor that the person is headed for physical and cognitive difficulties. The shrinking potential support ratio is one of the motivations for lifelong formal and informal learning, as the over 65 population faces a trend toward fewer and fewer younger adults to support us. Now, the PSR is the number of late adolescents and younger adults to every person over the age of 65. Now, globally, it was 12 to 1 in 1950. Here we see that in 2015 in the United States, the PSR was down to only 4 to 1. 4 persons between the ages of 15 to 64 to every 1 person over the age of 65. And here we see that in the developed world, the wealthier countries that have the highest percentages of older people, the PSR is projected to be only 2 to 1 in 1950. So we are entering an era in human history when we as senior citizens probably going to have to pull our own weight much later into old age than our parents and grandparents did. And the nation may not be able to sustain the social and economic safety nets that we currently see. Here are some age distribution comparisons in the United States. I'll look at 1930 versus the projection for 2030. Now, 2030 is the year that the last baby boomer in the U.S. will turn 65. The age distributions seem to be flattening out. Another incentive for learning and growing throughout life is the development and sustainment of self-esteem. Robbins and Zanussi, 2005, is among numerous studies that have investigated this phenomenon. Robbins and Zanussi used a single-item self-esteem scale with a Likert-type self-rating, and they applied this instrument with research participants from spanning 8 decades in the lifespan. According to their findings, self-esteem seems to peak in the mid-60s and then begins to decline in the 70s on average. Now, this is probably going to apply less to the people in this audience, as we are all, by definition, lifelong learners. But the onset of physical frailty and retirement or partial retirement into a different income bracket or socioeconomic category may still take its toll on self-esteem. We can, however, alleviate the additional factor that many in our age group face of finding themselves with outdated skills and the perception of being left behind by rapid societal and technological change. Therefore, an underlying premise of this, or assumption of this study, is that lifelong learning, for multiple reasons, is not only a desirable goal, but also an essential fact of modern life. There simply is no desirable alternative. Researchers have identified several types of barriers to lifelong learning. Attitudinal barriers might include a lack of confidence in one's ability to learn something new, possibly a bad memory of an attempt to learn something new in the past, or it could be an unwillingness to commit the time and resources. Physical or material barriers would include such things as the prohibitively high cost associated with formal education, or perhaps the individual lives too far from a community college or university, or perhaps the individual lives in an area that does not have broadband internet and so cannot sign up for online learning. Or maybe broadband is available, but the person just can't afford it. Structural or institutional barriers might be the result of local colleges and universities that do not offer continuing education or leisure learning programs. And informational barriers may be the result of information that is not readily available or not obviously available, or that is available in such a way that accessing it takes what is perceived by the individual as too much of a commitment of time and resources. Now, in this study, I hypothesized that a combination of two different types of barriers, a dispositional barrier and an informational barrier, contribute to a composite barrier to lifelong learning, and that the dynamics between the two are such that if it is possible to reduce the informational barrier component, then the dispositional barrier would no longer apply. Now, the theoretical frameworks that inform this study are lifespan theory, andragogy, cognitive load theory, and e-learning theory. And let's look at each one of these in some detail. But before we do that, it would be helpful when we examine particularly lifespan theory and cognitive load theory if we first refamiliarize ourselves with how memory works. Now, here is a model of memory adapted from Atkinson and Schifrin, 1968. This is a commonly accepted model of memory. And here we see inputs coming into working memory from sensory registers and from long-term memory as well. Note the finite capacity of working memory. On average, an individual can manage 7, give or take 2, chunks of information concurrently within working memory. And then there are some references in the paper to back this up. The important point about what constitutes a chunk of information in working memory is that it is highly variable. For example, if you were trying to incorporate a new telephone number into long-term memory, the phone number minus the area code is 7 digits, so each individual digit would be a chunk of information in that case. However, if you're trying to learn something new about a theoretical framework and it reminds you of something that you already know within that theoretical framework, or possibly even within another theoretical framework, then you would retrieve the entire schema from long-term memory for that theoretical framework and bring it into working memory as a single chunk of information. So a chunk can be a single atomic piece of information, like a single digit, or it can be a very complex schema or an object, as a computer scientist would think of it. Lifespan theory, Baltus and Baltus, describes human development as a lifelong process. Moreover, human development happens in multiple dimensions, socially and emotionally, cognitively and biologically, with gains and losses at every phase of development, young and old. Plasticity is the ability to adapt from the level of the neuron to the behaviors of the complete individual, all the way up to human society. At the neuronal level, when one region of the brain suffers an impairment, whether from some physical trauma or even from early stages of dementia, other regions of the brain can step up and take on some of the functionality previously handled by the damaged region. Also, even in healthy, cognitively unimpaired individuals, if an area of the brain needs additional horsepower due to above average demands placed on the functionality provided by that region, then neurogenesis, the generation of new nervous system cells or neurons from neural stem cells, will provide the extra density and additional synapses and connections to meet those demands. A well-known study by McGuire, Willett, and Spires, 2006, found that a structural MRI examination of the brains of London cab drivers shows a hippocampal region of greater than average size. And the hypothesis is that the hippocampal region, believed to be involved in spatial reasoning and navigational skills, grows itself to meet the demands of years of acquiring a detailed mental map of the city of London. Behavioral plasticity is any willful act or process initiated by the individual for the purpose of changing and adapting in response to a biological or sociocultural influence or some internal motivation to change. Societal plasticity is generally described in terms of constraints on the individual within society. Some of these constraints, unfortunately, may be legally or culturally imposed, but others may be simply the result of the individual's responses to societal influences, or even to the habits of the individual. There are also interactions between social and behavioral influences and neuronal plasticity. Davidson and McEwen, 2012, describe examples from rats to humans, indicating that an enriched social environment as well as daily physical activity will stimulate neurogenesis. Lifespan theory also accounts for human development within historical and cultural context. Biocultural co-constructivism, we're going to see that illustrated on the next slide, but essentially it is the assertion that the individual's development is due not only to biological, social, and cultural influences, but also on how the individual responds to those influences and the decisions made in response. As the phenomenologists would say, we co-create our own reality. A selective optimization with compensation suggests that as we get older, we tend to be more selective in how we expend resources, including time. We might have, for example, fewer but better friendships. The compensation part comes into play when the elderly individual chooses, for example, to listen to more books on audible.com rather than spend time reading because of declining eyesight, plus the fact that they can accomplish a nice healthy walk while hearing someone read the book to them. The main takeaway from selective optimization with compensation for the purposes of this study is that it suggests that if some desirable activity is deemed as too costly in terms of time or other resources, then the elderly individual may simply choose not to do it. Now, here we have an illustration of biocultural co-constructivism that incorporates the concept of plasticity and also incorporates an idea from William James about habit. The largest circle here is the sphere of the individual and what is under their control. In this sphere we see behavioral plasticity, willful acts, and so by definition under the control of the individual. And we see habit. Now, William James described habit as the great flywheel of society, something that keeps the individual within a particular orbit within society. The difficulty of breaking out of this orbit may be regarded as societal plasticity, but habit may be the individual's control mechanism for breaking through this type of societal constraint in the absence of legal or cultural mandates and constraints on the individual. The biological and the social cultural spheres impinge upon the individual sphere, and there is some interaction, but the individual in most cases has the largest role. Gains and losses occur in every phase of development. Now, lest you think that this is just not true, here are some striking examples of gains accompanied by losses very early in life, as well as an example from old age. Now, very early in life, around age 2, the brain matures to the point that the toddler gains the capacity to process language, and so begins to have the capacity to apply a verbal narrative to day-to-day experiences. The toddler then transitions from the sensory encoding of these experiences into long-term memory to verbally encoding these memories, and we'll do that for the rest of our lives. But this gain is accompanied by the eventual loss of the ability to retrieve those early sensory encoded memories. Then, in adolescence, the brain matures to the point that the individual gains the ability to foresee the consequences of a contemplated course of action or a behavior. However, it can be demonstrated that there is an accompanying loss during that age of some speed of reaction time. Now, in old age, the individual will typically lose some working memory capacity. However, the older adult will have gained over a lifetime a rich store of memory schemas, and so will be able to more efficiently utilize working memory. Remember that we can handle those 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information, and so the older adult will have more and more complex schemas to bring in as individual chunks, and so we'll be able to more efficiently utilize working memory, even though that may be down to 6 plus or minus 2 chunks as we get older, but those chunks are going to be much more efficient. Lifespan theory suggests that as we age, our goal orientation shifts from being primarily growth-oriented to one of primarily maintenance and prevention of loss. However, continuing to learn and educate oneself throughout life will help to keep growth as a motivating factor to some extent. Control processes, primary versus secondary. The primary control process is the individual changing the environment to meet their own needs or desires. The secondary control process is the individual changing themselves to adapt to the needs of the environment. Now, the primary control process is generally preferred, and in fact, Baltus cautions that the attempt by many aging adults to maintain the primary control process much further into old age and to do so by proxy is a serious threat to independence, because the older adult may surrender some autonomy in exchange for having a younger person exert primary control over their environment on their behalf. So lifelong learning may offer a better alternative to maintaining the primary control process later into life. We can't exercise primary control over an environment that we don't understand, and we may certainly be reluctant to change ourselves and our behaviors to adapt to such an environment. But if I understand the history and the issues that led to the current state of affairs, then I may feel capable of becoming involved in a dialogue that may somehow impact society. And there is the opportunity for some degree of primary control. Now, Malcolm Knowles developed the educational paradigm of andragogy in response to some observations of his own and those of his mentor, Alfred North Whitehead. Knowles studied educational journal articles from the 1920s through 1948 and noted that as adult education became more and more common during those years, there were quite a few articles in that era in which educators concluded that pedagogy was not applicable to the adult learner, and they would go on to describe rather guiltily their improvisations to circumvent the shortcomings of pedagogy. Knowles also noted that his mentor, Whitehead, had observed that one of the major tenets of pedagogy was the goal of transferring to the learner a body of knowledge that had stood the test of time. Whitehead suggested that this goal was only appropriate when the time for major societal and technological change was greater than the average human lifespan. By the early 20th century, this was no longer the case, and so a new educational paradigm, according to Whitehead, was needed. As we saw in previous slides, fundamental societal change can happen now within less than a decade, and major technological change can happen in a matter of days. Contrast that with the era of Socrates in the West and Confucius in the East, when society and certainly technology changed very little in the course of the average human lifespan, and you may begin to see Whitehead's argument. Now, here we see illustration of one of the major differences in pedagogy and andragogy. Pedagogy, on the left, the art of and science of teaching the child, is content-centered, and the content is pushed out to the learner. Andragogy is problem-centered, and the individual learner is there in the middle, directing the learning experience and seeking out both content and instruction. Note the two-way arrows under andragogy between the learner and the content. As the learner becomes a more integral part of the process and begins to contribute back into the content. Cognitive load theory. There are three types of cognitive load. There is extraneous cognitive load. This is just noise. It contributes nothing to the learning task or learning goals, and it is simply an artifact of the way that the learning task has been designed. And it is always to be minimized when possible. Germane cognitive load, this describes the sum of the mental processes that must come into play to accomplish the learning task. And intrinsic cognitive load. Now, this is the payload. This relates directly to the complexity of the learning task. So a major tenet of cognitive load theory is that we have a finite capacity within working memory. And if you recall the memory model that we looked at and the 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information that we can handle, I believe that was a paper by Miller around 1957, suggesting that. And as you can see, we do have a limited capacity, so you want to minimize the extraneous cognitive load and keep all of that noise out of working memory. Now, e-learning theory was developed from these other theories we've looked at: andragogy, cognitive load theory, and lifespan theory. And it is all about the application of technology to facilitate educational goals. An important note is that e-learning theory is built on an awareness that human learning can only be enhanced by technology. It cannot be changed by technology. And that is it's the educational goals that drive the technology, not the other way around. Now, e-learning theory suggests that we can use technology to modify and optimize the presentation of information to the learner and thereby reduce extraneous cognitive load. And that is the intention of this study, to use technology to present the learning outcomes stated in course descriptions in the course catalog in an upfront manner so that the potential student can view and select the available learning outcomes and only then be presented with a recommended set of courses based on the learning outcomes that they have selected. And now I just want to do a brief demo of the application to show you how what I just said is going to work. Here is the web application that I developed for this experiment, for this project. I've produced a supplemental video that goes into much more detail about the makeup of the system and all the different things. But it's a very simple idea, and here is how the student will be able to select from a set of learning outcomes that will have been extracted from the course descriptions in the course catalog, and then receive a set of recommendations. First, we're already there on the planner, so we'll go back home, go to the planner in the menu, and then expand one of the knowledge areas. Okay, let's look at history and current affairs. And here you see stated learning outcomes with a checkbox on the left of each one. Find one you want, check the box beside it, and under the hood, the recommendation has already been made. And now if you go to the recommendation tab, here is our recommendation based on discuss the changing tenor of race relations in America. That's the very learning outcome that we just selected. And so now if you click on the recommendation, you're going to be asked to rate the recommendation with regard to what your expectations were when you selected that learning outcome. And then at this point, if you like the recommendation, the student can simply call or go to the Leisure Learning website and register for the course. So that's really all I wanted to show you in this presentation. As I said, there's a much more detailed presentation out on YouTube. A word about site selection. In addition to the obvious advantage of proximity, the UWF Leisure Learning Institute has a lot to recommend it as a site for this type of study. Each member, averaging an age between 65 and 75, according to the director, is by definition a lifelong learner. In addition, Leisure Learning Institute at UWF offers an eclectic mix of courses, such that it is a great example of the concept of lifelong learning also needing to be, as someone said, life-wide. Remember the 4 pillars of education. I think that there's definitely something from each of the 4 pillars to be learned at the Leisure Learning Center. And here we see the catchment area for the UWF Leisure Learning Institute. In 2019, all but 4 of the 459 members who signed up for courses came from zip codes within these 4 local counties. That's Escambia, Santa Rosa, and Okaloosa, and then Baldwin County, Alabama. That seems to be the primary catchment area for the UWF Leisure Learning program. Those 4 outliers that I mentioned who weren't from those 4 counties reported zip codes from far distant states, Kansas, Nevada, Minnesota, and Arkansas. So they were extreme outliers. Possibly they were just new to the area and reporting a previous permanent address, but they weren't from around here. Now, if you access the U.S. Census data from 2010 and add up the figures from each of these 4 counties in our local catchment area, here's what you get. Of a total of 812,078 population in the region in 2010, 140,332 are over the age of 65, and then 505,794 are between the ages of 18 and 64. Well, the national average for people over the age of 65 is 16%, and this works out to about 17.4% for our local area over the age of 65. According to the director of the Leisure Learning, most of the members have at least a bachelor's degree, and many have advanced degrees. Of our region's 140,332 senior citizens, 21,515 have at least a bachelor's degree, and 16,622 have advanced or professional degrees. Here we see a comparison of the local catchment area with the national averages for educational attainment among people over the age of 65. The local area is significantly under the national average for people over 65 with at least a bachelor's degree, but we're significantly over the national average for people over the age of 65 with advanced or professional degrees. And the total membership of Leisure Learning, according to the director, is around 500. And of those 500, 459 signed up for one or more classes in 2019. So that's very good participation. Research design. The research design is a pre-test, post-test control group design as described by Campbell and Stanley in 1963. Once we have identified the experimental group, then I will provide the director with a set of 30 user accounts for authentication into the Scholasticity application for the experimental group. These accounts are all owned by the Scholastic domain, that is, they're owned by me. And so anyone authenticating into this application with one of those accounts does so anonymously. And we'll be sure to get probably a signed agreement from the experimental group participants that they will not authenticate into the Scholastic web application with their own email, Google email accounts. They're going to have to use one of these anonymous accounts. Each participant will have a participant number that the director will assign to them, and then will provide to me. That's all I will have with regard to the participants, just a number. And then I will provide all instruments pre-labeled with the individual participant numbers, and the director, of course, would be the only one capable of sending these correctly pre-labeled instruments to the individual assigned to that particular participant number. I will also have a cross-reference of which participant number is associated with which Scholastic domain account for authentication. Still, I have no traceability back to the individual. However, this will enable me to do any desired within-group analysis for the experimental group. We will then distribute the pre-test instruments, and I will prepare a YouTube training video to accompany the user's guide for the purposes of training the experimental group to use the Scholastic application. Research questions. Now, you may notice there are more research questions in the paper than these, but I didn't want to just duplicate those here. So this is the essence of the research questions. Is there a significant difference in reported perceived cognitive load involved in selecting courses for the semester between the experimental and the control group? That is, do the people who use the web application to select their courses report less perceived mental effort than do the people in the control group who will continue to use the traditional method of selecting a set of courses? How closely do the course recommendations made by the web application fit with the expectations of the student when they were selecting the learning outcome that led to the recommendation? Is there a significant impact on reported course satisfaction? Does a comparison of the course satisfaction or the student assessment of instruction survey, is there a significant difference between the experimental and control groups in those ratings? The Leisure Learning Director has agreed to ask for volunteers for sample selection from among the active members to participate in the research project. There are over 450 active members, and those as defined by those who signed up for at least one course during 2019. We only need 60. Once we've inducted a sufficient number of participants and have their informed consent forms signed, then the director will randomly assign those participants to one of two groups. Let's say Group A or Group B. Once that process is complete, the director will flip a coin and make one of the groups the experimental group. This way we don't have any bias, so the director isn't going to know at the time she assigns someone to one or the other group which one is the experimental group. That will come at a subsequent step in the process. And so once the experimental group is chosen, obviously the remaining group will be the control group. The data collection instruments will be for the pretest, the Computer Self-Efficacy Scale, Murphy, Coover, and Owen, 1989. and the Computer Anxiety Scale, Cooper-Gator 2015. Now for the post-test, the Perceived Mental Effort Rating Scale, PAS 1992. It will consist of a single question with 9 possible single select answers. The question will be, how would you describe the mental effort involved in selecting a set of courses for this semester? And the possible responses will range from 1, very, very little mental effort, up to 9, very, very high mental effort. And the UWF Student Assessment of Instruction. Now other data sources, these are built into the Scholastic application and so can only be applied to the experimental group. The Likert type rating scale for the course recommendations that we saw in the little demo, and time spent on modal dialogue containing the course recommendation. That's exactly why I made that a modal dialogue, so that I could easily capture the amount of time between when you open the modal dialogue and when you close it. So we will have that data, so we'll know that someone spent 3,000 milliseconds viewing the recommendation, and then we'll know whether that led to just hitting cancel or whether it led to actual rating it and saving it, and then we'll know what the rating is. So we'll have all of that data. It's just so easy to have that data that it just seems like we should do something with it. So that's why I built it into the data analysis plan. So the data analysis plan is to do an analysis of covariance, ANCOVA, between groups using the pretest scores on computer self-efficacy and computer anxiety as covariates with the post-test ratings of perceived mental effort. This will be a useful analysis for both the experimental and control group, because someone in the control group, for example, may be more comfortable using technology for the course selection task, but they were put into the control group, so they're still being asked to do it the old school way, read the course catalog, that sort of thing. So the expectation for that person might be that the higher the score on computer self-efficacy and the lower the score on computer anxiety, then the higher the rating on perceived mental effort for selecting a course. The other sources of data that are built into the Scholastic application will provide opportunities for within-group analysis of variance. Thank you. And now I would ask for questions and feedback, and for that we'll have that WebEx meeting on Monday. And I thank you all very much.